Authorities are telling us that it's a resolution to one of the defining events in Austin's history.
Yeah, KVUE News has confirmed investigators with the Austin Police Department believe they have solved the infamous yogurt shop murders after nearly 34 years.
4 teenage girls murdered in a yogurt shop. 34 years of silence. Everyone thought this case was cold until one tiny bullet casing revealed the impossible.
Whatever John has learned that he has not shared with us has given him great confidence that this may really be the resolution to a case that has gone on way too long and has ruined way too many lives. Today we've learned that there is a new suspect.
The words still echo like a curse over the city of Austin, Texas. 4 lives, barely begun, ended in the most brutal way imaginable. Not in some distant crime-ridden alleyway, but in the warm, fluorescent glow of a neighborhood yogurt shop. It was supposed to be a place of innocence, a hangout where friends shared frozen treats, whispered secrets, and dreamed of the future. On that December night in 1991, those dreams were snuffed out by fire, smoke, and unimaginable violence. Imagine the scene. Austin was alive with the pulse of the holidays. The streets hummed with the anticipation of Christmas. Families packed into malls for last-minute shopping. Carols drifted from radios. Lights twinkled on suburban houses. And tucked away in a modest strip mall stood a little shop that had become part of the community's fabric. I can't believe it's yogurt. It was the kind of place parents trusted to be safe, wholesome, and ordinary. But when the fire trucks pulled up, just after midnight, the smoke spilling from its roof carried with it something darker. Flames licked the signage, and the air carried the unmistakable odor of burning fabric, melted plastic, and something else firefighters could never forget: the sharp metallic tang of blood hidden beneath the smoke. Inside, it was chaos. Tables overturned, walls blackened, sprinklers hissed, adding steam to the heat. Firefighters fought to douse the flames, expecting nothing more sinister than property damage. But when the smoke cleared, the horror revealed itself. 4 bodies, charred beyond recognition, lying together in the back of the shop. They were teenagers. Children, really. Their last moments had not been defined by the laughter of friendship, but by terror and brutality. News spread quickly, traveling faster than the smoke that still hung over the strip mall. Parents clutched their children tighter that night. Austin had always carried itself as a city caught between small-town familiarity and growing urban bustle, but nothing in its history had prepared it for this. 4 girls, murdered, set on fire, and left as if their lives were disposable. This city demanded answers. Police rushed to the scene, combing through the debris, the melted countertops, the ashes. But what they found was confusion. Evidence compromised by fire. A crime scene contaminated by chaos. The killers, if there was one or many, had left behind more questions than answers. And in the days, weeks, and months that followed, those questions only multiplied. Who would kill 4 teenage girls in a yogurt shop? Why this place? Why that night? The families of the victims, Eliza, Jennifer, Sarah, and Amy, were thrust into the darkest chapter of their lives. Their grief was raw, unrelenting. The media turned their daughters into headlines. Photographs splashed across newspapers with captions that never captured the depth of their loss. 4 teens murdered in shop fire. But behind those headlines were parents burying children, siblings suddenly alone, friends haunted by the empty chairs at school. And Austin, a city known for its music, its culture, its promise of progress, found itself branded by tragedy. The police worked tirelessly, or so it seemed. Suspects were questioned, Leads followed. For a moment, it felt like answers were close. But every time hope flickered, it was extinguished. The case slipped into that chilling category known as a cold case. Years passed. The yogurt shop was gone, but the memory remained, whispered about in classrooms, retold in hushed tones at sleepovers. For those who lived in Austin in the 90s, it became the kind of story that defined an era, a cautionary tale for parents, a nightmare no one could ever truly wake up from. And yet for law enforcement, it was a scar. They had arrested men before, paraded them in court, tried to convince the public the case was solved, but convictions were overturned. Testimonies collapsed. Evidence didn't hold. And with each failure, the truth seemed further away. So, the city learned to live with it. The yogurt shop murders became legend, a story whispered with the same reverence reserved for urban myths, except this one was true. 4 teenagers were murdered, and nobody was ever truly held accountable. It became a wound passed from one generation of investigators to the next. Some retired without answers. Others died never knowing who had committed the crime. For 34 years, silence stretched. And in that silence, theories grew. Conspiracies thrived. Some believed it was a random act of violence, 4 unlucky girls in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others thought it was organized, a ritual, a cult, something too dark for the city to admit. Every rumor seemed plausible when the truth was absent. Every explanation seemed possible when no answers were forthcoming. But then, almost without warning, science whispered what memory and witnesses never could. A bullet casing. One tiny piece of metal overlooked in the mountain of evidence. For decades, it sat there, silent, waiting. Technology wasn't ready to tell its story back then, but time has a way of turning silence into revelation. Forensic science advanced. DNA analysis leapt forward. Ballistics became more precise. And suddenly, investigators had tools that their predecessors could never have imagined in 1991. They revisited the casing, and what it revealed changed everything. It pointed not to one of the long-suspected young men dragged through years of wrongful trials, but to someone else entirely, a name barely whispered in connection to the case before. A man with his own history of violence, a man long dead, his story seemingly closed, yet the bullet casing tied him irrevocably to the yogurt shop on that December night. His name? Robert Eugene Brashers. The revelation hit like lightning. For 34 years, the yogurt shop murders had stood as an open wound, a symbol of failure, and now suddenly, science had given it a voice. A piece of evidence once thought insignificant had spoken louder than decades of speculation, louder than any courtroom testimony, louder than the silence that had haunted families for generations. But with revelation came new fear. If Brashers was there that night, was he alone? Or was he just one piece of a larger puzzle? Did the casing finally close the case, or did it unlock an even darker truth that Austin wasn't ready to face? The story you're about to hear isn't just about a murder. It's about failure and redemption, about silence and revelation, about the fragility of truth in the face of time. Because 4 teenage girls were murdered in a yogurt shop, 34 years of silence followed. Everyone thought this case was cold until one tiny bullet casing revealed the impossible. The fire call itself didn't sound extraordinary. At 11:47 p.m., Austin firefighters were dispatched to a small blaze at a strip mall along West Anderson Lane. The note on their pagers simply read, "Smoke coming from yogurt shop." That's it. Just smoke. But when the first engine arrived, The firefighters immediately felt the wrongness in the air. There wasn't the roar of a spreading inferno or the frantic chaos of people fleeing. The parking lot was eerily quiet, save for the hum of neon signs flickering above neighboring stores. And yet, thin black smoke was curling upward, seeping through cracks in the shattered front door. Inside, the shop looked like any small-town yogurt place. Tables, chairs, bright posters half melted by the heat. But the atmosphere was heavy, suffocating, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The firefighters moved cautiously, flashlights cutting through the haze. One of them stopped. At first, what his light revealed looked like a mannequin, burned, twisted, half collapsed near the rear of the store. But then, the shape resolved into something unmistakable. A hand. A human hand. "Body!" he shouted. Within seconds, the room turned into a nightmare. The discovery. One by one, they realized there wasn't just one victim. There were four teenage girls. Their bodies were clustered in the back of the shop, partially burned, partially hidden by debris. The firefighters froze, their instincts to extinguish the flames now overwhelmed by horror. The heat from the fire had distorted the room, but the smell told the truth. Not just burned furniture, not just melted plastic, but human flesh. What shocked them even more was how the bodies were arranged. 3 were bound together, huddled near the storage area. Another lay slightly apart as if she'd tried to escape. The positioning suggested terror. It suggested violence long before the fire had started. And here's where the first cliffhanger drops. The fire was no accident. As the blaze was extinguished, investigators quickly noticed patterns. The fire hadn't spread naturally. It had been started deliberately, using accelerants. Pooled burn marks showed where liquid had been poured. Someone hadn't just wanted to kill the girls. Someone had wanted to erase the scene. The cash register was open, a few bills scattered nearby. On the surface, it looked like robbery. But the sheer brutality of what had been done to these girls, teenagers working a late-night shift, made it clear this wasn't just about money. This was about control, about cruelty. And then came the forensics nightmare. The fire hadn't just taken lives, it had destroyed evidence. Fingerprints melted, surfaces warped, clothing charred. Detectives were left with a crime scene that felt deliberately sabotaged, a crime scene that whispered, but refused to speak. The names of the 4 victims would soon echo across Austin. Jennifer Harbison, 17. Sarah Harbison, 15. Eliza Thomas, 17. Amy Ayers, 13. The Harbison sisters and their friends had been closing the yogurt shop after a normal Friday shift. They had plans for a sleepover, plans for the weekend. Instead, they became victims of one of the most brutal crimes Austin had ever seen. Parents gathered outside the strip mall in disbelief as word spread. A yogurt shop, a place for families, a place for kids, had turned into a slaughterhouse. Austin, a city not yet known for big city crime, was plunged into fear. If 4 teenage girls could be murdered in a public strip mall, who was safe? And yet, as shocking as the brutality was, there was something else that would haunt investigators for decades. It wasn't just the murder. It was the silence that followed. Normally, murder investigations spark momentum in their early days. Tips flood in, suspects emerge, leads get chased. But here, the opposite happened. Every clue seemed to disintegrate. Witnesses recalled nothing unusual. The strip mall was quiet. Security cameras were almost non-existent in 1991. And whatever evidence may have remained intact was largely obliterated by the fire. Detectives pieced together theories, but nothing fit neatly. Multiple assailants, a botched robbery, a targeted attack. Each idea crumbled under scrutiny. Weeks passed, then months, then years. The yogurt shop murders slipped into Austin's history as the unsolved nightmare, the kind of story parents whispered to their children as a warning. And in that silence, another problem grew. Doubt. There were arrests. There were confessions. At least what prosecutors claimed were confessions. In the mid-1990s, 4 young men were paraded before the cameras, accused of taking part in the murders. For a while, it looked like justice had finally come. But the case collapsed. The confessions were contradictory, riddled with errors. DNA evidence excluded them. Eventually, all 4 men were released, their lives shattered by accusations, but without convictions. The public's trust in law enforcement withered. Families of the victims felt abandoned, and the city carried the weight of 4 unsolved murders. Girls who never got to grow up, families who never got answers. Decades passed, 34 years of silence, 34 years of birthdays missed, school reunions unfilled, justice denied. But silence doesn't mean absence. Because while Austin forgot, the case file sat waiting. The evidence boxes gathered dust. And inside one of those boxes was a tiny piece of brass. Overlooked, ignored, and nearly discarded as irrelevant. A bullet casing. The kind of detail so small it could vanish in the chaos of a crime scene. But when modern forensic eyes examined it again, decades later, the casing whispered something shocking. Something that could unravel everything investigators once believed about the yogurt shop murders. And that's when the impossible became possible again. Before I tell you what that bullet casing revealed, I need to ask you something. I've spent hours digging into the darkest corners of this case, piecing together fragments that authorities left behind. If you've made it this far into the story, it means you care about truth. It means you care about the 4 girls who never got to go home that night. So if you haven't subscribed yet, I have to ask, why not? You can keep scrolling. You can leave without pressing a button. But if you do, think about it. You'll walk away just like the people who walked away from this case for 34 years. Silent, passive, hoping someone else will care enough to act. So hit subscribe, or at least leave a comment telling me why you won't. Because silence doesn't bring justice. Action does. The yogurt shop murders weren't just a tragedy. They became a riddle locked behind smoke and ash. And for decades, that riddle seemed unsolvable. But what investigators missed that night, what they failed to see buried in the soot, would one day resurface. And when it did, it shattered everything. The crime scene at the yogurt shop was barely cold when the weight of the investigation crashed down on the Austin Police Department. The brutality of the crime had shaken the entire city, and detectives knew they had little time to deliver answers. 4 teenage girls, bound, burned, and executed. Austin wanted justice, and it wanted it now. But the scene itself, it was chaos. Detectives swarmed the yogurt shop before dawn. Evidence technicians combed through the wreckage with latex gloves and tweezers, trying to salvage anything that had survived the fire. But with every hour, the fire's destruction revealed itself more clearly. The accelerant had not only blackened the walls, it had erased vital evidence. Fingerprints melted. Footprints scorched into invisibility. Fibers and hair singed beyond recognition. All they had were fragments, a few unburned pieces of clothing, charred money from the register, and some bullet fragments lodged in the walls. Still, the mood in those first hours wasn't despair. It was determination. Detectives believed that with enough pressure, enough manpower, and enough interviews, someone would slip. Someone would talk. But they were wrong. The strip mall where the yogurt shop stood wasn't deserted that night. A neighboring shop owner recalled locking up. A passerby swore they saw the lights on inside after 10 p.m. Another insisted the girls had been laughing and talking just before closing. But when it came to identifying a suspect, nothing. No strange cars, no unfamiliar faces, no sounds of struggle. It was as though the killers had slipped in and out of existence. For detectives, the pressure was relentless. Every day that passed without an arrest deepened the sense of failure. Politicians quietly pressed for results. Families begged for closure. The public began to whisper, maybe Austin police aren't capable of solving this one. And in that vacuum of pressure, mistakes were made. By 1992, the case had gone cold, but detectives were unwilling to admit it. Instead, they clung to thin leads, chasing rumors that the killers were local boys who bragged about it at parties. In the mid-90s, 4 men, Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Forrest Wellborn, and Maurice Pierce, were arrested and accused of taking part in the murders. At last, Austin thought, the killers had faces. The prosecution leaned heavily on confessions. Under hours of interrogation, young men broke down, saying what detectives seemed to want to hear. Michael Scott, shaking and terrified, told investigators he was there. Robert Springsteen allegedly admitted to pulling the trigger. For the families, it was bittersweet relief. Finally, after years of silence, justice seemed possible. But here's the cliffhanger. Those confessions weren't the truth. When the trials began, the defense shredded the state's case. There was no physical evidence tying the men to the yogurt shop. The confessions, full of contradictions. Details didn't match the crime scene. One defendant described the wrong order of events. Another placed victims in the wrong location. And DNA testing, new and evolving in the 1990s, excluded them. One by one, the cases unraveled. Convictions were overturned, charges were dropped. And by the mid-2000s, all 4 men walked free, their reputations in ruins, but no longer facing death row. The city of Austin was humiliated. Detectives had spent over a decade chasing shadows, prosecuting the wrong people while the real killers remained free. And worse, the public's faith in law enforcement was shattered. For the Harbison, Thomas, and Ayers families, the overturned convictions were a second death. They had already lost their daughters. Now they had lost justice too. Parents described sleepless nights, replaying the last hours of their children's lives. Siblings carried survivor's guilt, wondering why their sisters had been taken and not them. The yogurt shop itself was long gone, but the site remained a scar. People left flowers on anniversaries. The memory of the girls never faded, but the hope of answers dimmed. And yet, in a box, locked away in evidence storage, something waited. A piece of brass. A casing. Not important in 1991. Overlooked in the frenzy of false confessions. But in time, it would prove louder than any testimony. By the late 1990s, the case was ice cold. Detectives retired, files were shuffled, and the yogurt shop murders became the kind of story told in hushed tones, a cautionary tale of failure. But cold doesn't mean forgotten. Advances in DNA testing were rewriting old cases across the country. Families wrote letters begging Austin police to re-examine the evidence. Reporters occasionally revisited the story, each time highlighting the tragedy of 4 teenage girls and the incompetence of an investigation that led nowhere. And every so often, a detective would pull the files out again, flipping through burned photographs, scorched clothing, charred bullets. That's when the casing resurfaced. But not yet. You've been listening for a long time now, and you can probably feel it. That frustration, that anger, that why hasn't this been solved yet fury. That's what the families felt. That's what the entire city felt. And if you've made it this far into the story and haven't subscribed, I have to ask, Why? Because leaving without subscribing is exactly like walking past that yogurt shop in 1991, seeing smoke in the window, and doing nothing. Pretending you didn't notice, pretending it isn't your problem. So, if you care about these girls, about their story, about truth, subscribe. Or at least drop a comment telling me why you won't. Don't be silent. Silence is what kept this case unsolved for 34 years. Even after the release of the accused men, detectives never officially closed the case. They couldn't. The brutality was too severe, the public memory too sharp. It haunted every officer who had ever touched it. Every few years, a new task force revisited the files. Fresh eyes scanned the photographs. Evidence was sent for new types of testing. Each time, hope flickered. Each time, it was extinguished. Until, and this is where the story edges closer to the impossible. Technology advanced enough to give that overlooked casing a voice. The investigation had been a mess. False confessions, wasted years, families betrayed. But the case file never disappeared. And inside, buried beneath the ashes of a failed investigation, was a single piece of evidence that hadn't yet told its story. A casing. Small. Forgotten. Waiting. And when it was finally examined decades later, it didn't just whisper the truth, it screamed it. The yogurt shop murders should have been the kind of case that exploded open within weeks. 4 girls brutally murdered in the heart of a busy strip mall, at an hour when people were still driving home from late dinners or filling up their cars with gas. Evidence was everywhere, or at least it should have been. And yet, the trail seemed to collapse almost as quickly as it appeared. When firefighters doused the flames, they unknowingly destroyed crucial pieces of the puzzle. The water washed away trace evidence, fingerprints smeared and melted in the heat, and what little biological material might have been left behind was compromised by both fire and flood. To make matters worse, the Austin Police Department wasn't prepared for a crime scene of this magnitude. Some officers admitted later that they had never investigated a mass murder before. Procedures were sloppy. Evidence wasn't logged properly. Chain of custody was broken in more than one instance. By the time investigators began sifting through what was left, frustration was already mounting. Forensic technology in 1991 was nowhere near what it is today. DNA testing existed, but it was slow, expensive, and not nearly as conclusive as it would later become. That left police chasing shadows, rumors, leads, and tips that went nowhere. Weeks turned into months, and the yogurt shop itself became a kind of scar on the city. Burned, boarded up, and silent, it stood as a daily reminder of 4 young lives stolen. The investigation, though, had hit quicksand. Witnesses who had seen suspicious men near the shop gave conflicting statements. Some said they saw 2 men leaving. Others said 4. Some recalled a dark vehicle speeding away. Others remembered nothing at all. None of the leads aligned cleanly, and detectives spent more time chasing contradictions than finding hard facts. And then came the pressure. Politicians demanded answers. Families demanded closure. The public wanted justice. But the police had nothing. So slowly, the case began to stall. Tips dried up, detectives rotated in and out, and the deeper they went, the more impossible it seemed that they would ever find the killers. But here's the thing. When law enforcement has nothing, sometimes they make something. And that decision would haunt this case for decades. By the mid-90s, the yogurt shop murders had taken on a life of their own. The case was constantly revisited in local newspapers, always framed with the same haunting question. How can a city like Austin, with all its resources, fail to solve this? The families of the victims never stopped speaking out. They attended vigils, pressed for updates, and criticized the police department openly. Their frustration wasn't just about the lack of arrests. It was about the feeling that their daughters' lives were slipping into the shadows of unsolved history. The public echoed their anger. In Austin coffee shops, in barber shops, in schools, people talked about the yogurt shop case like it was a scar they all shared. Parents whispered about whether it was safe to let their children go out at night. Teenagers dared each other to drive past the boarded-up store as though the very walls still held the echo of that night. And every year that passed without resolution made the anger sharper. One local journalist described it best. It wasn't just that we wanted justice, we needed it. We needed to believe our city could protect us. But every day the case went unsolved, that belief cracked a little more. And when belief cracks, conspiracies rush in to fill the void. At first, they were simple. Maybe the killers were drifters, just passing through. Maybe it was a robbery gone wrong. But as the years dragged on, darker theories emerged. Some people became convinced that the yogurt shop murders were part of a satanic ritual. This was the early 1990s, after all, the height of the satanic panic. Across the country, communities were gripped by fear that hidden cults were performing rituals, sacrificing animals, and even children. For Austin, the brutal deaths of 4 girls in a small store fit into that narrative. Candles had been sold at the yogurt shop. Fire was used to cover the crime. Whispers spread. Was this random violence or ritualistic murder? Others thought it was a cover-up. The sheer incompetence of the investigation seemed suspicious. How could so much evidence disappear? How could the city's most infamous case remain unsolved for so long? Conspiracy theorists claimed that someone with influence must have been involved and that the police were intentionally burying the truth. And then there was another theory, the most chilling of all. Some locals whispered that the murders weren't random at all, that the girls had been targeted, that someone close to them had orchestrated the entire thing. And if that was true, then the killers might still be walking among them. But what no one realized, however, was that in the midst of all these conspiracies, somewhere in the evidence boxes gathering dust, there was a single object that had the power to break everything wide open. But we'll get to that. Now, if you followed the story this far, I need to pause and ask you something. This case has haunted Austin for more than 30 decades. Families waited their whole lives for answers. And if you're watching this video and still haven't subscribed, you have to ask yourself, why? If you care enough to hear the story of these 4 girls, to keep their memory alive, to demand the truth even decades later, then subscribing is more than just clicking a button. It's a way of saying you refuse to let their story disappear like the evidence almost did. So go ahead, subscribe, or at the very least, comment below and tell me what's stopping you. And as the families grew more desperate, the police made a move that would change the course of the case forever. They arrested 4 young men. But were they really the killers? Or just convenient scapegoats? That's where the story twists next. The arrests came in 1999, 8 years after the yogurt shop murders. And on the surface, they looked like a breakthrough. 4 young men, teenagers at the time of the crime, were charged with the brutal killings. Their names were paraded in headlines, their faces splashed across TV screens. For a moment, it seemed like justice had finally arrived, but the reality was far darker. The arrests hinged on confessions. Detectives claimed the young men had admitted to their involvement, detailing how the murders happened. It sounded airtight, but there was a problem. None of their statements lined up. One suspect said they entered through the front door. Another insisted it was the back. One described shooting the girls, but ballistics didn't match his account. Another confessed to setting the fire, but later recanted, saying he was pressured. And that was the core issue: pressure. The interrogations were long, grueling, and manipulative. Detectives dangled promises of leniency, implied threats of harsher punishment, and played psychological games designed to break the suspects down. In the end, they cracked. They said what detectives wanted to hear. But when forensic experts reviewed the case, they found glaring inconsistencies. The physical evidence didn't place the men at the scene. DNA excluded them. The details in their confessions contradicted reality. Still, prosecutors pushed forward. When the trials began, Austin was split in two. On one side, there were those who wanted closure, who didn't care about the holes in the case. They believed justice, even flawed justice, was better than none at all. On the other side were skeptics, lawyers, journalists, even ordinary citizens who saw the case as a miscarriage of justice in the making. The families of the victims were caught in the middle. They wanted to believe the killers were finally caught. But as the years went on, doubts gnawed at them too. Some of them even said publicly that they weren't sure these men had done it. That kind of division doesn't just stall a case, it poisons it. And as appeals dragged on, as retrials were delayed, as evidence sat in boxes gathering dust, Austin was left with one overwhelming question. Would this case ever be solved? But silence doesn't always mean death. Somewhere, deep in those dusty evidence boxes, was a clue that no one had paid attention to. A clue that seemed almost too small to matter. A single bullet casing, waiting to rewrite the story. By now, the case wasn't just about the murders. It was about what they represented. People in Austin had lost faith in their justice system. They had seen suspects paraded as killers, only to be cleared years later. They had seen evidence mishandled, families betrayed, and rumors spiral out of control. The yogurt shop murders became more than a case. They became a symbol of everything that could go wrong in a system designed to protect. And let me pause here for a second, because if you've made it this far, through the frustration, the conspiracies, the false confessions, you have to ask yourself something. Why wouldn't you subscribe? If you don't, this video ends. The story fades, and just like the police files shoved into boxes, these girls' voices get buried again. That's the reality. So either hit that subscribe button or comment below and tell me why their story doesn't matter enough for you to keep it alive. By the late 2000s, appeals had unraveled the convictions. The suspects were released, their cases dismissed. For the families, it was a nightmare all over again. Justice given, then snatched away. And so, nearly 20 years after the yogurt shop murders, Austin was right back where it started. 4 young girls dead, no answers, no justice. The public frustration only grew. Vigil after vigil was held, candle after candle was lit, but the flames flickered out just like they had that night in 1991, leaving only smoke and darkness behind. And still, the conspiracies persisted. Some believed the killers had vanished into thin air. Others insisted the real truth had been buried forever. But the story wasn't over. Because in the midst of all the chaos, in the boxes of evidence that no one bothered to recheck, that single bullet casing waited. And when technology finally caught up, when forensic science became powerful enough to examine it, everything changed. For nearly 30 decades, the yogurt shop murders were a ghost haunting Austin. Evidence sat boxed away in dusty archives, confessions had been discredited, suspects freed, and families left adrift in a sea of silence. But silence has a strange way of deceiving. Sometimes it makes you believe a story has ended, when in reality, the first words of the final chapter are just being written. And in this case, that chapter began not with a shocking confession, not with a surprise witness, but with science. By the 2010s, forensic science had transformed. What had been slow, imprecise, and unreliable in 1991 had become lightning fast, accurate, and, most importantly, capable of solving cases once thought impossible. New forms of DNA testing could extract usable profiles from the tiniest traces, samples that would have been considered worthless 2 decades earlier. Cold case units across the country began reopening dusty files, hoping modern science could succeed where human investigation had failed. The Austin Police Department, battered by years of criticism, turned back to the yogurt shop case. Inside those boxes, preserved in spite of fire, flood, and human error, were items that had never been tested with the precision now available. Among them, clothing, biological material, and a single, unassuming bullet casing. At first, investigators weren't optimistic. They had been burned before. Previous DNA tests had failed to match anyone in the system. But as forensic technology advanced, what once seemed invisible could suddenly be seen in stunning clarity. And so, quietly, behind the scenes, samples from the yogurt shop evidence were retested. What came back was astonishing. The new DNA profile didn't just rule people out, it pointed in. It was strong, it was clear, and it belonged to someone who had never been on investigators' radar before. Someone whose crimes stretched beyond Austin. Someone whose name, at first, meant nothing to the detectives reviewing the case. But that name would soon send shockwaves through the investigation. Robert Eugene Brashers. But who was Brashers? And why had his shadow lingered over unsolved cases for decades without anyone connecting the dots? Robert Eugene Brashers lived a double life. On the surface, he seemed ordinary, just another man drifting through small towns across the Midwest and the South. But behind the mask, he was a predator. Forensic databases began tying him to crimes committed in states miles away from Texas. Sexual assaults, murders, crimes marked by brutality and precision. And now suddenly, his DNA had appeared in connection with the yogurt shop murders? It was the break no one thought would ever come. But as investigators dug deeper, the story became even more twisted. Because Brashers wasn't just a suspect, he was dead. He had taken his own life years earlier, leaving behind more questions than answers. In April 1999, police cornered Robert Brashers in a motel. They wanted him on charges unrelated to Austin, charges that tied him to other violent crimes. But before they could take him alive, Brashers turned his weapon on himself. The suicide should have closed his story forever. But what he left behind, his gun, his belongings, his blood, would one day help open one of the darkest chapters in Austin's history. It was that weapon, preserved in an evidence locker hundreds of miles away, that held the key to the yogurt shop murders. Because when investigators finally tested the bullet casing from the Austin crime scene against Brashers' gun, the results were impossible to ignore. And I need to stop here for just a second, because think about what you've just heard. For nearly 30 years, families were told this case was cold, unsolvable, finished. And yet the truth was sitting in boxes, waiting for someone to care enough to look again. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, you need to ask yourself, why? Why stay silent when silence is what almost buried this case forever? Click subscribe, because otherwise, the next time a case like this disappears into the shadows, maybe no one will bother to reopen it. The DNA was one thing, but the casing, the single, unassuming casing, was about to tie Brash's suicide weapon directly to the yogurt shop murders. And when it did, the story that Austin thought it knew collapsed overnight.
Justice or just an answer? For the families of the victims, the breakthrough was bittersweet. On the one hand, they finally had a name, a face, a weapon, proof that the case wasn't unsolvable. But on the other hand, Brashers was dead. He'd escaped accountability, robbed them of the chance to face him in court, to hear him confess, to see justice carried out. It wasn't justice in the traditional sense. It was just an answer. And sometimes an answer is the cruelest resolution of all. Because even with the DNA, even with the casing, even with Brashers' name on the record, the yogurt shop murders still leave us with one haunting question. Was Robert Eugene Brashers acting alone? Or was there someone else in that yogurt shop on the night of December 6th, 1991? The evidence suggests the story isn't finished. Robert Eugene Brashers was a ghost long before investigators linked his name to the yogurt shop murders. By the time his DNA whispered across the decades, he had already taken his own life. And the gun he used to end his story, a cold steel .22, would become the very piece of evidence that brought him back into the center of Austin's darkest night. It was April 1999. Brashers was in Kennett, Missouri. He was wanted in connection to a string of violent crimes, including assaults and home invasions that stretched across several states. The net was closing in. Law enforcement had him cornered in his girlfriend's home. The air was tense, heavy with inevitability. Brashers knew he wasn't walking out free. Instead of surrendering, he raised the gun to his head and pulled the trigger. A single shot. One moment of silence after years of brutality. His story ended in a dim room, surrounded not by a jury or justice, but by the echoes of his own violence. At the time, investigators cataloged the weapon, bagged it as evidence, and closed his file under the neat label of suicide. They had no idea that years later, forensic science would dust off that weapon and find that it carried the weight of 4 teenage girls murdered in an Austin yogurt shop. The match was undeniable. The bolt casing from the yogurt shop, forgotten, once considered useless, aligned perfectly with Brashers' suicide weapon. It was as if the dead man's hand had reached out of the grave to confess. But here's the question that haunted everyone. If Brashers was dead, what did that actually mean for justice? In true crime, there's a kind of ritual we expect. A suspect is identified, arrested, tried, and either convicted or acquitted. There's a trial, a gavel, a sentence. Families cry in court. Victims' names are read aloud, and there is at least the illusion of closure. But with Brashers, none of that was possible. He couldn't stand trial. He couldn't sit in a courtroom and face the families of Jennifer, Eliza, Amy, and Sarah. He couldn't be forced to explain how or why. His death sealed his mouth shut forever. So what does that mean? Did the yogurt shop case finally have an answer? Or was this just another cruel trick? A ghost suspect, a dead end, masquerading as closure. For the victims' families, the revelation was like salt in a wound. Yes, there was relief in knowing his name, in tying his gun to that night. But there was also rage. Rage that he had denied them the chance to look him in the eye. Rage that he had slipped into death on his own terms, not theirs. And then came the deeper, darker fear. What if Brashers wasn't the only one? Could there have been more than one killer? The yogurt shop crime scene has baffled investigators for decades, precisely because it doesn't read like the work of a single person. 4 girls, bound and gagged. The fire set in multiple points as if to erase evidence deliberately. Signs of sexual assault. Could one man have managed all of that? Skeptics argue it's unlikely. The level of control, the speed, the brutality, it all suggests multiple perpetrators. Even the Austin police at various points pursued theories of multiple attackers. Witnesses swore they saw more than one suspicious man in the area. DNA samples hinted at more than one profile, though degradation made them inconclusive. So when Brashers' name surfaced, it didn't shut the door on these doubts. If anything, it cracked them open wider. Maybe he was there. Maybe he pulled the trigger. But was someone else standing beside him? The thought sends a chill, because if that's true, then someone else has been walking free for over 34 years. Someone who never faced suspicion, never pulled a gun on themselves, never left a weapon behind to betray them. And where there are gaps, conspiracy theories rush in like floodwater. Some locals whisper that the yogurt shop murders were never random, that the girls stumbled into something darker that night, perhaps a drug operation, a robbery gone wrong, or even occult-related violence. The fire, the bindings, the overkill, all of it, they argue, points to something ritualistic. Others wonder if law enforcement deliberately mishandled the case. After all, 4 men were once arrested, interrogated, and accused, only to have their cases collapse under scrutiny. Was this incompetence or a cover-up? And then there are those who insist the Brashers revelation is too neat. A dead suspect, unable to defend himself, suddenly blamed thanks to forensic evidence that lay dormant for decades. To them, it feels like an easy way for authorities to tie a bow on a case that had haunted Austin for too long. And here's where the story sharpens its edge. Even with Brashers' DNA, even with his gun, we can't say with certainty that he acted alone. So what does that mean? That somewhere out there, in the quiet corners of America, someone else knows what happened that night. Someone else has carried the weight of silence for 34 years. Someone else has blood on their hands.
The story still isn't over. Which brings us back to now. 34 years later, and the yogurt shop murders still linger like smoke in the air. Brashers is dead, yes. His weapon ties him to the scene, yes. But the girls' families don't feel closure. The public doesn't feel closure. And the deeper you look, the more it feels like this story refuses to end. Maybe the truth is that it can't end. Not until every shadow in that yogurt shop is accounted for. Not until we know if Brashers was alone or if others walked out into the night, leaving flames and screams behind. Not until the conspiracy theories are answered, one by one. But until then, the yogurt shop murders remain one of America's darkest puzzles. A story where the suspect is dead, the evidence is partial, and the silence is deafening. And here's the uncomfortable part. Maybe we'll never know the full truth. Maybe the case will always sit in this limbo, half solved, half forgotten, waiting for a piece of evidence that may never come. Before we move on, let me ask you something. You've sat here with me, through decades of silence, through fire, through DNA, through the ghost of Robert Eugene Brashers. You've given this case your time and attention because something in you wants answers, just like the families do. So why not take that one extra step? Subscribe, comment, be part of the conversation. Or don't. But if you don't, tell me why. Because silence, in its own way, is complicity. And in cases like this, silence is the one thing we can't afford. Robert Eugene Brashers may be dead, but the yogurt shop murders are still alive. The question that lingers is not whether he was there, but who else might have been standing beside him. And that's where we go next. Austin has grown and changed in the 34 years since the yogurt shop murders. Coffee shops now sit where old stores once stood. Music festivals draw thousands every year. And the city has earned its reputation as the live music capital of the world. But for some, Austin is still the city of 4 murdered girls: Jennifer, Eliza, Amy, and Sarah. 4 names frozen in time. 4 families who will never see graduations, weddings, or grandchildren. For them, Austin is a place of unanswered questions, where the smell of smoke never quite clears. For the parents, siblings, and relatives, the revelation of Robert Eugene Brashers was not closure. It was just another chapter in a book they never asked to read. "He took the easy way out," one parent said quietly, years after learning of Brashers' suicide. "He denied us justice." Others spoke of betrayal, not by Brashers alone, but by the system itself. They endured decades of false starts, wrongful arrests, and shattered promises. They watched as prosecutors paraded suspects who later walked free. They carried the weight of public doubt as whispers of conspiracies and cover-ups overshadowed their daughter's memory. And when Brasher's name surfaced, it was almost cruel. A ghost suspect. A man who couldn't be tried, couldn't be questioned, couldn't be forced to answer the one word the families had screamed for years. Why? For them, the yogurt shop murders aren't history. They are daily life. They are the empty chairs at dinner tables, the photographs that gather dust but never age, the anniversaries that reopen wounds. The case became a stain on Austin's conscience. People who lived there in 1991 still talk about it in hushed tones. They remember driving by the yogurt shop that night, seeing the smoke. They remember the fear that followed when no one knew if the killer was still out there. Parents locked their doors tighter. Teenagers stopped going out late. Austin's innocence burned alongside the shop. Even now, when documentaries air or podcasts revisit the case, those old fears resurface. Survivors of that era shake their heads and wonder aloud, how can something like this still be unsolved?
And the younger generation, who weren't even born when it happened, inherit the unease. They walk the same streets, but they carry the story like folklore. Austin's ghost story. A reminder that beneath the music and lights, darkness once lingered. The truth is, the yogurt shop murders are more than a case. They are a test of faith, in justice, in law enforcement, in closure itself. Robert Eugene Brashers' DNA and his suicide weapon gave us pieces of the puzzle, but they didn't finish the picture. And that's the torment. The pieces we're missing may never be found. Could Brashers have acted alone? Possibly. Could there have been accomplices? Many believe so. Were the girls' deaths the result of something bigger? A robbery, a conspiracy, or something ritualistic? No one can say with certainty. What we do know is this: 4 teenage girls walked into a yogurt shop to close up for the night. They laughed, they counted money, they prepared to go home. They never left alive. And 34 years later, the city of Austin is still asking the same question. Why? Before we close this chapter, I want to ask you directly. You've made it this far, through the smoke, through the conspiracies, through the name of a man who can never be tried. You've given this story your time, your attention, your emotions. So why stop short of adding your voice? Subscribe, comment, be part of the fight to keep these girls' names alive. Because every time someone stays silent, the memory of Jennifer, Eliza, Amy, and Sarah fades just a little more. And silence is exactly what has protected their killers for 34 years. So if you choose not to subscribe, tell me why. Say it out loud. Don't let your silence echo the silence that has haunted Austin since 1991. Robert Eugene Brashers is gone. The yogurt shop is gone. But the shadow remains. And maybe that's the cruelest truth of all. Sometimes the darkest patterns don't end. They just linger. In memory, in mystery, in fire that never goes out.